This morning we're going to be talking about 2 Samuel 16, and we're in that part of Absalom's uprising and revolt where David has been forced to depart from Jerusalem. Last time we looked in chapter 15 at how Absalom stole the hearts of the people of Israel. He did this by standing at the gate and telling everybody that came in for a court decision or a dispute of some sort that, oh, if I were the guy in charge, I would side with you. There wasn't a plaintiff that Absalom disagreed with. He made a promise that, oh, if someone would appoint me judge in the land, I could hear every case personally. That would be pretty impressive, since not even Moses could do that. And now, after Absalom has done this for a period of about 4 years, or perhaps a different period of time, depending on how various Bibles handle the textual variant, Absalom sends spies throughout Israel to declare himself king. He tells David he's going to fulfill a vow at Hebron, but in reality he's going to Hebron to declare himself king. And he gets behind him one of David's most important advisors, Ahithophel the Gileadite. And the bulk of chapter 15 and the bulk of chapter 16 is David's flight from Jerusalem to Gilead. And I noted on Thursday night, but I'll reproduce this chart here, that what we have kind of neatly divides itself into two sections in chapters 15 and 16. We have, of course, David's friends at the latter part of chapter 15. And on the other side, we have David's adversaries, or enemies. Allies, adversaries, and just going down, among David's friends, we have Ittai the Gittite, we have Zadok and Abiathar, the priests, and we have Hushai the Archite, who never has his government position explained. Every time he appears in Samuel, and in Chronicles, he's always referred to as the king's friend. I guess that was, maybe it wasn't an official title, but he was somebody that was a friend to the king, perhaps another counselor like Ahithophel. On the other side of this, we have adversaries. And we're going to look at Ziba and Mephibosheth, although I'm going to put a question mark next to this, next to Mephibosheth, because of what we run into in chapter 19 suggests that maybe Mephibosheth is not really an adversary at all. Second, we have a guy named Shimei, who is cursing David as he goes. And finally, David's third adversary, whom he doesn't personally meet with, but who does meet with Hushai, is Ahithophel. And we noted last time that this sequence is actually parallel to itself. For instance, in the case of Ittai doesn't have to be a friend to David. He's not expected to be a friend to David. But nonetheless, he insists on going along with David anyway, even though he doesn't owe David anything. By contrast, Ziba claims Mephibosheth does this as well. Well, Ziba offers David gifts, but he says, oh, Mephibosheth, he's not on your side. Even though David had done a bunch of nice things for Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth wouldn't stand with him. So here we have a case of a man who is helpful when he doesn't have to be, and a man who is unhelpful when he really should be. Zadok and Abiathar, they try to bring the Ark of the Covenant with David, and David says, no, you don't come with me, you don't bring the Ark with me. The reason why is because this is in the hands of the Lord. Perhaps the Lord will have favor on me and bring me back. But I'm not going to try to bring God with me by stealing his furniture. So David refuses their help based on the Lord's will. Contrast with Shimei, who curses David as he goes, and somebody offers to cut off Shimei's head, and David refuses for the same reason. Perhaps the Lord told him to do that. David refuses to have someone killed based on the Lord's will. You see the parallel connecting these two is the Lord's will. And thirdly, we have Hushai, the king's friend, who pretends to be Absalom's friend and gives him bad advice, versus Ahithophel, who pretended to be David's friend but gives Absalom good advice. So these characters are in contrast, and that'll play out more in chapter 17. So that's just something to keep in mind. It's a neat little way of noting how the story is put together. In chapter 16, and let's go ahead and read the first 4 verses and learn about Ziba. Somebody read verses 1 through 4.
Now when David had passed a little beyond the summit, behold, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, met him with a couple of saddle donkeys. And on them were 200 loaves of bread, 100 clusters of raisins, and 100 summer fruits, and a jug of wine. The king said to Ziba, "Why do you have these?" And Ziba said, "The donkeys are for the king's household to ride, and the bread and summer fruit for the young men to eat, and the wine for whoever is faint in the wilderness to drink." And the king said, "Where is your master's son?" And Ziba said to the king, "Behold, he is staying in Jerusalem. For he said, Today the house of Israel will restore the kingdom of my father to me." So the king said to Ziba, "Behold, all that belongs to Mephibosheth is yours." And Ziba said, "I prostrate myself. Let me find favor in your sight, O my lord the king."
Okay. All right, so Ziba. Now, what would you say about this encounter with Ziba? How has he reacted to David's plight? Read the first couple of verses. What's it look like?
Brought help.
Oh, he's bringing help. Look at all the stuff he's bringing, right? Lots of bread, raisins, fruits, wine, donkeys. He gives all these things to David. He grants David provisions. All right, so is Ziba a friend or a foe? And ignore what I wrote on the board for a minute. Is he a friend or a foe? This is a point where you can argue with what I wrote on the board, because that ain't gospel.
I don't know that he's necessarily evil either. Perhaps he's maybe a fence rider.
He's a fence rider. Why? What makes you say he's a fence rider?
Well,
Politician.
Huh?
I think that most of Israel knew, if they thought about it, that David was God's anointed. God had preserved David through everything Saul tried to do to destroy him. Absalom has made himself the king, obviously without God's favor, if anybody wanted to look at it. And so I just have a sneaking hunch that Ziba figured all of this out and said, this is just a temporary thing. God's going to bring him back, so I'll forward his favor now.
Ziba grants David provisions. That's true. Keith, you got something?
Well, Ziba was Mephibosheth's servant.
Yes.
Mephibosheth was Jonathan's son, right?
Yes.
So David took care of Jonathan's son. Perhaps Mephibosheth encouraged him to do exploits because David looked after Mephibosheth.
So Mephibosheth is the one who sent these gifts, but Ziba invents this whole other story. That's possible. That is possible. And so we can think about that. Now, here's the interesting thing. He gives David these provisions. Where's he going to get the provisions in the first place, if not from his master? But something, there's one thing Ziba doesn't offer to do that everybody else up to this point has. What is it?
Say that again.
There's one thing that everybody up to this point has offered to do for David, and Ziba doesn't do it. Every person we've encountered in the story
Are you talking about the coat torn and looking like they're in mourning?
It's not that, although that's telling, certainly. Ziba is never described as having his clothes torn and being in mourning, whereas we get to chapter 19 and we notice that Mephibosheth hasn't shaved and hasn't bathed himself, hasn't taken care of himself since David's been gone, which is telling. Okay? There's one other thing, a little more crucial than that. What do all three of these guys do that Ziba does not do? Or rather, what do they offer to do? Sometimes the simplest answer is best. It's not that profound, but...
Go kill him. Go kill his adversary.
Do it?
Go take care of his adversary.
Well...
I don't see that he offers to cross over with David and stay with David. He brings him food, but in here...
No, you're right.
I'll cross over and be with you?
No.
I don't think he does. But
Ziba does not offer to do that. Now, granted, I don't know if Hushai is explicitly said to do that. David just tells him, don't come with me, go with Ahithophel. There seems to be indication that, Ittai explicitly says, I'm going with you, and David can't talk him out of it. Zadok and Abiathar want to go with him. David says, go back to Jerusalem, you're more useful there. Hushai, he tells him the same thing. Ziba, there's no indication, I'm going to travel with you. None of that. He grants David's provisions, but he goes back to the city, Jerusalem. David's question is the same question that we have. We see Ziba, and Ziba is always associated in our minds with Mephibosheth. So we see Ziba, we ask ourselves the question, where is Mephibosheth? What happened to him? And David asks the same question we're thinking.
Is there any indication that Ziba ever helped David after this in the story? I don't think there is.
He doesn't appear in the story very often. Ziba, what does Ziba claim Mephibosheth is saying here?
God's going to return the kingship to me.
Oh, yeah. Does that make sense?
Not really.
Not really? Why not?
Well, Absalom had made himself king.
Yeah, Absalom had made...
God be returning the kingdom to Mephibosheth.
Absalom's coup, that's not going to give any power back to Saul. It's going to re-centralize power in Hebron and in Judah. And it's further strange in light of the fact that David already showed Mephibosheth kindness. David already gave him back Saul's land. And so Ziba reports and says, oh, Mephibosheth, he's not loyal to you. He thinks he's going to get his father's kingdom back out of this. And David makes a ruling, a rather hasty ruling. And his verdict is that all the land and the property gets transferred to Ziba. Now, was David wise in doing this?
Probably not.
Probably not. Why not?
Well, we don't see anything about him consulting the Lord before he did it to find out what the truth of this situation was. And in fact, at the end of the story, we still don't see him seeking counsel of God to find out the truth.
Proverbs 18 and verse 13 says, he who gives an answer before he hears, it is folly and shame to him. Proverbs 18 and verse 17 says that the first to plead his case seems right until another comes and examines him. You want to know, if you listen to only one side of the story, which side of the story is right? Well, obviously the side you listen to. Nobody ever listens to one side of the story and automatically... Well, it's very rare somebody will listen to one side of the story and go, oh, well, that side's wrong. You got to listen to both sides of it. Always. Because if you only hear one side of the story, you can make a very hasty and unwise decision. Usually the person telling their half of the story is telling it in such a way to, remove their own warts, remove their own flaws. And this is just basic truism of life. Now, of course, a little later on in 2 Samuel 19, David encounters Mephibosheth, and we'll look at that when we get to chapter 19. Mephibosheth claims that Ziba lied. And we'll talk a little bit, who's telling the truth, who's lying, how do we know? There are ways we can tell based on how the story is told. Whose side is Ziba really on?
Ziba's.
He's on his own side. That's right. Yeah, he's not on David's side. He's playing both sides against the middle. Because on the one hand, he gives David provisions, a little discreetly, but he does it. And he ingratiates himself to David. But on the other hand, he stays where Absalom is ruling to demonstrate loyalty in case, Absalom succeeds. And, of course, he lies about Mephibosheth, and who wins in this scenario? Who profited? Well, he did. Ziba profited because he got all the land. He got all of Mephibosheth's stuff. Now, a little later on in chapter 19, David insists, okay, y'all, I can't tell who's telling the truth, so we're going to divide the land between you two. And Mephibosheth's response to that says, he can take it all. I don't care. My lord the king is back. Which, that's telling as well. Like dividing the living child in two. We might see later on in 1 Kings chapter 3, whenever Solomon is rendering a verdict as well. So, Ziba, you expect him to be a friend, but he turns out to not be quite so friendly to David. Any questions up to this point? All right, now we're going to tackle Shimei. Not literally tackle him. We're going to go verses 5 through 14. Somebody read verses 5 through 14.
Now when King David came to Bahurim, there was a man from the family of the house of Saul whose name was Shimei, son of Gera, coming from there. He came out cursing continuously as he came. And he threw stones at David and at all the servants of King David. And all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. Also Shimei said thus when he cursed, come out, bloodthirsty man, you rogue. The Lord has brought upon you the blood of the house of Saul, in whose days you have reigned. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom, your son. So now you are caught in your own evil, because you are a bloodthirsty man. Then Abishai, son of Zeruiah, said to the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Please let me go over and take off his head. But the king said, what have I to do with you, you sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord has said to him, curse David. Who then shall say, why have you done so? And David said to Abishai and all his servants, see how my son who came from my own body seeks my life? How much more now may this Benjamin? Let him alone, let him curse, for so the Lord has ordered him. It may be that the Lord will look on my affliction, and that the Lord will repay me with good for his cursing this day. And as David and his men went along the road, Shimei went along the hillside opposite him and cursed him as he went, threw stones at him, and kicked up dust. Now the king and all the people who were with him became weary, so they refreshed themselves here.
All right. Why does Shimei act like this? I mean, we've never seen this guy before, so why is he acting like this towards David?
Well, he was a relative of Saul.
Okay, he's a relative of Saul. And how would that affect things?
Well, as the dynasty continued under Saul, he would have been in a much better position in the kingdom.
Yeah.
And as a member of the royal family.
Right. Yeah, Shimei's kind of lost out a little bit on the pomp and circumstance of being part of the king's people. This is, in fact, the second reference we have in this text to Saul's former kingdom. You notice how they keep bringing this up. You know, Ziba puts words in Mephibosheth's mouth and says, oh, the Lord's going to return the kingdom of my father to me. And now here Shimei's getting, the Lord's paying you back for what you did to Saul. Well, of course, he's throwing rocks at David and his servants. He calls him a man of bloodshed, a son of Belial, or worthlessness. And he attributes David's suffering to God's justice. God is repaying you for bloodshed. Is that true? Is God repaying David for bloodshed?
Yeah.
He is.
Not the same thing that probably he's referring to.
Oh, so wrong bloodshed. That's what we got here. Yeah.
Well, David should have acted on Amnon's there are a number of things David should have done.
You're right. There are a number of things he should have done.
He should have done, and he did. And the Lord said it would sword would always be discretion. I had a thought, but I missed it.
Oh. No. Okay. I mean, there's quite a few things that, there's quite a few things that, David has had this coming for a while. I mean, if he hadn't Saul and taken and had his way with Bathsheba, if he hadn't had Uriah killed, if he had dealt better with the strife in his own household, yeah, he wouldn't be where he is. The Lord is repaying David for bloodshed, but not the bloodshed Shimei says he's repaying him for. He's kind of confusing cause and effect here. The bloodshed of the house of Saul, David is rather innocent in that respect.
Well, David's completely innocent. Saul brought every bit of that upon himself.
Right.
But it's interesting to me how that when Saul sought David to kill him, David refused to lift his hand against God's anointed, and now this grandson of Saul, we could say son of Saul, is lifting his hand against David, and David refuses to lift his hand against the grandson of the Lord's anointed.
You're right. We're going to look.
The attitude towards Saul and Saul's family has never wavered from the fact that I'm not going to seek vengeance against them.
We're going to come back to that. It throws. I mean, you look at all this. We should be asking the question, of course, if the Lord is repaying David because he did bad things to the house of Saul, why isn't the kingdom going back to Saul?
Yeah.
Where's that? We are asking the same question we were in verse 3. Well, how does Absalom's coup fit that? Why is it that David's descendant gets to stay on the throne?
As a matter of fact, David rewarded the men that was it Gilead that came and took the body of Saul and his sons.
Jabesh Gilead.
Gilead, that's right. He rewarded them for taking Saul and Jonathan's bodies down and burying them properly so the enemy wasn't able to display them anymore.
Now, we need to appreciate something. The text of Samuel goes out of its way to show David is innocent in the fall of King Saul. But when it comes to Uriah the Hittite, David is singled out for condemnation on that particular incident. So he's guilty in the matter of Uriah the Hittite of bloodshed, but not in the matter of putting Saul to death. Well, of course, Abishai has a neat little proposal. What does Abishai suggest? What does Abishai suggest they do? What's his proposal here?
Go take this dead dog's head off his shoulder.
Yeah, exactly. Let's go cut off his head.
Sort of what happened to Saul and Jonathan in the final battle.
This conversation, actually, between David and Abishai, we've seen it before. Where have we seen it before? Anybody remember?
When Saul was pursuing him and his men saw opportunity.
Yeah.
He and a couple of his men snuck down into Saul's camp, didn't they?
Yeah.
And then said, "Let me kill Saul right now."
Abishai was the one that said that. In 1 Samuel 20. Yeah. 1 Samuel 26.
Okay.
It's these same two guys that had this conversation. In 1 Samuel 26, in verses 8 through 11. They go into Saul's camp. The spear's in the ground at his head. And in verse 8, Abishai said to David, "Today God has delivered your enemy into your hand. Now therefore, please let me strike him with the spear to the ground with one stroke, and I will not strike him the second time." But David said to Abishai, "Do not destroy him. For who can stretch out his hand against the Lord's anointed and be without guilt?" David also said, "As the Lord lives, surely the Lord will strike him. Or his day will come that he dies, or he will go down into battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I should stretch out my hand against the Lord's anointed. But now please take the spear that is at his head and the jug of water and let us go." You see how very similar those two things are, actually? Those two conversations between David and Abishai are? Abishai wants to kill, but David forbids him, and instead insists that the Lord must take care of it. It's the same attitude we saw he had in the wilderness towards Saul is now exhibited towards Shimei as he's going through the wilderness once again. Yes?
So this brings to my mind the question, and we don't have an answer for it. Was it because Abishai had this conversation with David now, and it was Abishai who said that, and David remembered their previous conversation? If somebody else had said this to David, "Let me just kill Shimei," might David have acted differently? I don't know.
We have no way of knowing the answer to that. I'm not particularly. I don't want to pass judgment on that. I think we're more intended to see that David's disposition has not changed. He's still the man after God's own heart that he's always been. The problem, he's not perfect, man. He's flawed, but
Then why would Shimei Chris like
Why would Shimei curse him like that? Bitter about the loss of Saul's kingdom, bitter about the loss of his power and position. Who knows? What Shimei's doing here is not right. Exodus 22 verse 28 says, "You shall not curse God, nor curse a ruler of your people." Which is what he's doing here. Shimei will pay for this later. Not in the book of Samuel, but in the book of Kings. We'll see that. David has... There's also some reminders of what happens with Nabal in 1 Samuel 25. David has the capacity to kill this man who curses him, but he doesn't even offer a harsh retort in response. He simply entrusts himself to God and waits for the day of reckoning. He does not utter any threats himself in return. He does not revile in response. What biblical character does this remind us of? Jesus, yes, there you go. 1 Peter chapter 2. 1 Peter chapter 2 and verses 21 through 23. We've noted several parallels to Jesus throughout this movement of David from Jerusalem. But in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21, it says, "You have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in His steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in His mouth. And while being reviled, He did not revile in return. While suffering, He uttered no threats, but kept entrusting Himself to the one who judges righteously." Now, not all of that's true of David. David actually did commit sin. But David doesn't revile in return, and David entrusts himself to the righteous judge. Mark, you have something.
Another point on that, when Paul was standing before the Sanhedrin and apparently his back was turned to the high priest or whatever, the high priest said, "Strike that man." That was in violation of the law. And Paul turned back and said, "God will strike you, you whitewashed wall." And someone said, "How dare you speak evil of the high priest?" And Paul said, "I'm sorry, I did not know it was the high priest, for the law says you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people."
Well,
so there was...
there's a couple of ways to read that encounter in Acts 23, and I kind of default to my sarcastic view of Paul in that instance, but that's the way it reads. Admittedly, I haven't had a chance to sit down and look at it, but
I really think that applies here. That principle applies here.
Right. Well, Exodus 22:28, "You shall not curse God, nor curse a ruler of your people." Saul does quote that. Paul quotes that in Acts 23. You're right. Yes. Abishai proposes cutting off Shimei's head because, Abishai has observed something that people without heads don't usually curse. So, but David has learned not to do that. He views God's will. How does David view God's will?
He's accepting it.
He's accepting it throughout this whole story. But here's the thing: does David actually know what the Lord's will is in this instance? No. Does he know? Oh, God told Shimei to curse me. Does he know that? He really doesn't know that. But in verse 11, he says, "Behold, my son who came out from me seeks my life. Then how much more this Benjamin? Let him alone and let him curse, for the Lord has told him." That's pretty strong language there. The Lord told him to do this. You don't know that, David. No, he doesn't. But what can we learn from this? The fact that David says that.
David is not going to act against something the Lord could possibly have said.
Exactly. David doesn't even say perhaps here. He just gives Shimei the benefit of the doubt. He won't even thwart a hypothetical action of God to serve his self-interest. There's a lesson in there for that. There's a lesson for us in that too. If it's possibly the Lord's will, what business do we have thwarting it? Well, David won't even go that far. Even if it's just a maybe, perhaps this is the Lord's idea. Now, verse 12, "Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction and return good instead of cursing this day." Perhaps the Lord will look on my affliction, or some versions have on my iniquity, which doesn't make as much sense, but it all has to do with vowel pointing in a complex Hebrew issue. But the Lord will look on my affliction and return good instead of evil this day. Perhaps he will do that. But even if he doesn't do that, David's not going to take action against Shimei. Because, this might have been the Lord's will. I've had it coming. And so eventually David comes to a resting place to refresh himself. There's I think a crucial lesson we can learn here about the Lord's will and how we should respond to it. And how careful we ought to be to make sure that all of our actions, all of our deeds are contingent on if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. James chapter 4 talks about that. You say, let's go here to such and such a place and do business, spend a year, engage in profit. You don't know what your life's going to be like. It's here today, gone tomorrow. Your life is like a vapor. Could vanish away at a moment. Your life is in the hand of the Lord. Instead, James says, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and also do this or that. That's in James chapter 4. All right, any comments or questions down to verse 14 of 2 Samuel 16? Okay. Now we get to Absalom's grand triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Let's look at verses 15 through 19.
Then Absalom and all the people, the men of Israel, entered Jerusalem, and Ahithophel with him. And it came about when Hushai the Archite, David's friend, came to Absalom, that Hushai said to Absalom, "Long live the king! Long live the king!" Absalom said to Hushai, "Is this your loyalty to your friend? Why did you not go with your friend?" Then Hushai said to Absalom, "No, for whom the Lord, this people, and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and with him I will remain. Besides, whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son? As I have served in your father's presence, so I will be in your presence."
Alright, so the scene shifts here. We got Absalom and his entrance to Jerusalem. And Ahithophel is with him. And then Hushai shows up. Oh, wait a second. I thought we were going to talk about Ahithophel among his adversaries. And Hushai is a friend. What's he doing here? What's Hushai doing in this scene?
He's making friends with Absalom.
He's making friends with Absalom. Is he switching sides?
Not at all.
No, he's not switching sides, but he's got to convince Absalom he is.
And I notice he doesn't say long live Absalom, long live Absalom. Long live the king, long live the king.
Long live the king. It's a little ambiguous, isn't it?
Ambiguous.
All right, yeah. Verse 17 also. Not verse 17, verse 18. For the Lord, whom the Lord, this people and all the men of Israel have chosen, his I will be, and his I will remain. Whoever the Lord chooses, I will follow him. Well, who is the Lord chosen? Well, Absalom hears that statement. It's me. But turns out not to be the case. Hushai is here on a mission from David. But ultimately, as we learn in chapter 17, it's a mission from God, who ordained to thwart the good counsel of Ahithophel. Absalom, is he suspicious of Hushai? Just a little bit?
Yeah, he is.
Might be, just a little bit. So how does Hushai convince him that he's really on Absalom's side?
Verse 19.
Flattery.
Flattery.
Words, he says, "Whom should I serve? Should I not serve in the presence of his son?
Yeah.
As I have served in your father's presence, so I will be in your presence."
Exactly. Loyalty to the Father equals loyalty to the Son. Clearly he's been reading the Gospel of John. I don't know how he did that since it hasn't been written yet, but yeah. I mean, Absalom's initially incredulous that Hushai would side with him over David, given their close friendship. But he's satisfied with Hushai's answer that his first allegiance is to Yahweh. I'm not particularly thrilled by that reasoning on Absalom's part. It's like how in the movies and the drug dealers ask an undercover cop if he's really a cop. There's this unwritten law in movies that he has to tell the truth, even though that's not real. That's one of those things. Otherwise, everyone seems to think that's a real thing. But what's going on here? Well, Hushai professes his loyalty to Absalom, and Absalom buys it after this statement. And then we're going to see a little bit of Ahithophel's wisdom at work in verses 20 through 23. Absalom said to Ahithophel, "Give your advice. What shall we do?" Ahithophel said to Absalom, "Go into your father's concubines, whom he has left to keep the house. Then all Israel will hear that you have made yourself odious to your father. The hands of all who are with you will also be strengthened." So they pitched a tent for Absalom on the roof, and Absalom went into his father's concubines in the sight of all Israel. The advice of Ahithophel, which he gave in those days, was as if one inquired of the word of God. So was all the advice of Ahithophel, regarded by both David and Absalom. All right, we talked a little bit last time about who Ahithophel was and why he might have been willing to turn against David. It's possible, it's likely, that he was Bathsheba's grandfather, and so David's handling of that particular incident is what spurred his rebellion. Well,
Bathsheba's grandfather.
did I say that? David's grandfather? Bathsheba's grandfather. He's not David's grandfather. My apologies. I did not mean to say it that way. Yeah, it is possible that Ahithophel was Bathsheba's grandfather. We learn this from reading the mighty men lists of 2 Samuel chapter 23 and comparing it with Bathsheba's own parentage in 2 Samuel chapter 11. Well, what is Ahithophel's advice here? And why does he give it?
The new king always inherits the entire harem of the old king. That was one of the ways they established their kingship. And so here, these concubines, was it 10 concubines? But were left
10.
behind. And so Absalom is to go in and take them as his own wife. His own wives. Therefore, Israel will understand that he has inherited the kingdom from his father.
Right. Absalom goes in, and this is a pretty common thing in the ancient world for kings to steal the wives of previous kings in order to secure their own claim on the throne. In 2 Samuel 3, for instance, Ishbosheth accuses Abner of taking one of his father's concubines, which would have been a power play on Abner's part, making himself strong in the house of Saul. There's another instance in 1 Kings chapter 2, where Adonijah requests one of David's last concubines, Abishag, as his own wife, which is Solomon interprets as a power play and has Adonijah killed in response. So there's things like that. There's a couple of other less clear examples of this in the Bible as well. But this is one instance where Absalom actually does the deed. But it says something else here too. You have something?
David knew this ancient thing about the concubines.
Right.
Maybe it was his purpose to leave his concubines, determined if Absalom was really trying to.
That's...
Once he saw that Absalom did, there was no doubt in his mind after that.
Right. Now that's that is a chilling interpretation of his motives, but yes, that's possible. Per verse 16 of chapter 15, the king went out and all his household with him, but the king left 10 concubines to keep the house.
They told him that.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, when you get to chapter 20, David comes back and he shuts them up like widows. You know, they're not permitted to go into the king's presence again, thus, further delegitimizing Absalom's claim on the whole thing. I mean, it's not a happy story here. This is politically motivated advice. Sleeping with his father's concubines was the point of no return. He would make himself odious to his father. He would make himself a stench to his father, is what this is saying. And it would also kind of lock in the people who had followed him a little bit more too. Now, they pitch a tent on the rooftop. Absalom takes these concubines in the sight of all Israel. Now, they can't see what's going on inside the tent, but they can see he went into the tent. They know what's going on inside that tent. Interesting actions for a man concerned about the rape of his sister Tamar. Violation of Levitical law, uncovering the nakedness of a father's wife, whether his mother or stepmother, was the same as uncovering the nakedness of the father, according to Leviticus 18 and verses 7 and 8. And also a fulfillment of 2 Samuel 12. You did this thing in secret, but I will do it in the sight of all Israel. He will lie with your wives in broad daylight. Well, David's companion, it says, would lie with his wives in broad daylight. In this case, it's his son who does this. And it sets the stage here. It's interesting, the Lord is fulfilling his word against David. Can the Lord use people being sinful to accomplish his will? Well, absolutely he can. That's another example of that. In verse 23, in verse 23 we learn about Ahithophel, and we'll close on this point. Ahithophel is so good at giving advice that David and Absalom thought inquiring of him was like inquiring of God. That's how good his advice was. It shows the gravity of the situation. Here we have this counselor who's virtually never wrong. And with him directing Absalom, Absalom is sure to win. Well, this of course sets the stage for what's going to happen in chapter 17. And how the Lord thwarts the counsel of Ahithophel. So we'll plan on chapter 17 next time, Lord willing. Any thoughts or comments before we close? All right. Discussion.
You should have given it to him.